My name is Captain Alexa Foster. I'm 34 years old, a cyber warfare officer in the United States Army. Right now, I'm standing at attention in my dress blue Army service uniform, and I'm being called a disgrace. Your Honor, she is a liability. Richard Cole, my father's personal attorney, roared, spit practically flying from his mouth. An officer currently under investigation by the Army's Criminal Investigation Division for gross misconduct. She is unfit to manage anything, let alone her late mother's estate. But the cruelest blow didn't come from the hired gun. It came from my father. I looked at Robert Foster. He wasn't just silent, he was smirking. A small, arrogant, satisfied lift at the corner of his mouth. He had handed the enemy the weapon, and he was savoring the moment he got to watch my public execution. They thought this humiliation would break me. They thought I was still the little girl desperate for his approval. They were wrong. They have no idea that my father inadvertently trained me to be tougher than he ever was, and they're about to find out what happens next. If you've ever been torn down and publicly shamed by your own family, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe, because this is the story of how I used the very discipline they despised to reclaim my honor. The words, gross misconduct, hung in the stale, conditioned air of the D.C. Superior Courtroom. They weren't just words, they were a tactical detonation. It felt like a stun grenade had gone off right next to my ear. The ambient noise of the room, the rustling of papers, the distant city traffic, the low hum of the fluorescent lights, all of it was sucked into a vacuum, replaced by a high-pitched, insistent ringing. I am trained to withstand pressure, to operate under fire, to compartmentalize chaos and execute a mission. But this wasn't a battlefield in some remote, hostile country. This was a courtroom in Washington, D.C., and the person orchestrating the attack, the one supplying the intelligence and the ordnance, was my own father. Richard Cole, his face florid with performative outrage, continued his assault. He paced before the judge's bench, his expensive Italian leather shoes squeaking softly on the polished floor. He was a caricature of a high-powered lawyer, from his perfectly coiffed silver hair to the immaculate tailoring of his Savile Row suit, a suit that probably cost more than my first car. He jabbed a finger in my direction, a gesture of pure theatricality. This isn't just about poor judgment, Your Honor. This is about a fundamental flaw in character, a disregard for rules and regulations that puts everything she touches at risk. I stood perfectly still, my hands clasped behind my back. My uniform felt like a second skin, the dark blue jacket crisp, the brass buttons gleaming, the ribbons on my chest a silent testament to years of service and sacrifice. It was a suit of armor forged in honor, and they were trying to paint it as a costume worn by a failure. The bitter irony burned in my throat. My father wasn't just trying to win ownership of my mother's lake house. He was trying to win an argument that was decades old. He was trying, in this public forum, to finally prove to the world and to himself that my entire life had been a catastrophic mistake. He wanted to prove I was a failure. My eyes, by instinct, flicked to my father. Robert Foster sat at the plaintiff's table, the picture of patrician composure. He wore what I privately called his lawyer face, an impassive mask of cool, intellectual detachment that betrayed nothing. It was the same face he'd worn my whole life whenever my world failed to align with his expectations. I was instantly thrown back to the moment I first told him about the CID inquiry. I had gone to his cavernous, book-lined study in his Georgetown brownstone, hoping for a sliver of fatherly support, perhaps even legal advice. He had listened, his fingers steepled under his chin, his gaze fixed on a point just over my shoulder. When I finished, he didn't ask, "What happened, Alexa?" He didn't ask, "Are you okay?" He leaned forward, his voice a low, cutting whisper, and said, "What did you do to embarrass this family?" Sitting beside him now was my older brother, Mark. He caught my eye for a fraction of a second before looking away, shaking his head with a sigh of practiced disappointment. Mark, the golden child, the vice president at a Wall Street hedge fund, the perfect reflection of our father's ambition. He was part of the prosecution. He and my father were a unified front, a fortress of judgment built on shared values of wealth and status, and I was on the outside, a soldier defending a border they refused to even acknowledge existed. They were one, and I was other. The familiar cold ache of exclusion settled deep in my bones. I forced myself to break my gaze away from them, from the toxic gravity of their disapproval, and focused on the only man in the room who mattered, Judge Donovan. He was an older man, likely in his late 70s, with a fringe of white hair and calm, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Throughout Cole's entire tirade, the judge hadn't interrupted. He hadn't shifted in his seat or looked down at his notes. He had simply watched me, his expression unreadable. He's assessing me, a voice in my head, the voice of my training, analyzed coolly. He's observing the target under pressure. He's waiting to see if I'll crack. Well, I'd stood before 3-star generals at the Pentagon and defended strategic operations worth billions of dollars. I wasn't going to be broken by a shouting civilian lawyer in a bespoke suit. Without conscious thought, my body settled into parade rest, my spine straightening to a rod, my chin held high, my feet shoulder-width apart. It was a posture of respect, but also of defiance, a silent declaration that I would not be moved. When Cole finally concluded his speech with a flourish and returned to his seat, a heavy silence descended upon the courtroom. The ringing in my ears subsided. All I could hear was the frantic pounding of my own heart. Robert Foster allowed himself another tiny, triumphant smirk, clearly believing he had landed the killing blow. Then Judge Donovan leaned back in his high-backed leather chair. The sound of the old leather creaking was unnervingly loud in the quiet room. He looked from Richard Cole to my father, and then his eyes settled on me once more. Slowly, deliberately, he reached up with both hands and unfastened the clasps of his black judicial robe at the collar. The room held its collective breath. With a smooth, practiced motion, he shrugged the heavy garment from his shoulders and let it fall over the back of his chair. And there, pinned to the starched white fabric of his dress shirt, was a single, gleaming silver star. The air hitched in my throat. It was the rank insignia of a retired brigadier general of the United States Army. My father's jaw, the very picture of smug certainty just a moment before, went slack. Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. Richard Cole's face turned a pale, sickly white. Judge Donovan looked directly at me, not as a judge to a defendant, but as one officer to another. His voice was not loud, but it filled every corner of the room with an undeniable, unshakable authority. "Captain," he said, his gaze unwavering, "you will address this court with the respect your uniform deserves." He picked up his gavel. The sharp, definitive crack echoed through the silent chamber. "This hearing is adjourned." The balance of power had just been completely upended. On the drive back from the courthouse to my small apartment in Arlington, crossing the Key Bridge with the familiar silhouette of the Georgetown waterfront gliding past my window, I asked myself why I was still surprised. My father's disdain wasn't a new weapon unveiled in today's hearing. It was an old monument, a landmark in our family's history, as old and weathered as the city itself. Its foundations were laid long ago, brick by painful brick, in the quiet, suffocating elegance of my childhood home. The house was a classic federal-style brick townhouse on a cobblestone street in Georgetown, the kind of place featured in glossy magazines. But inside, behind the gleaming black door and the perfectly symmetrical windows, the air was always thin, always tense. The memories that surface most vividly are of our Sunday dinners. They were a mandatory ritual. We'd gather in the formal dining room, the heavy mahogany table polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the cold light of the crystal chandelier. My father, Robert, would always sit at the head of the table, holding court. He wouldn't ask about our day. He would lecture. His monologues were a relentless rotation of legal theory, political commentary, and the immutable laws of success as dictated by him. He saw the world as a courtroom, and in our family, he was the judge, the jury, and the prosecution. There was no defense. My mother, Elaine, before she got sick, was the silent diplomat. She sat at the opposite end of the table, a gentle buffer against his sharp edges. I can still see her, her hands twisting a linen napkin in her lap, her smile strained. "Robert, dear, don't be so hard on her," she would murmur, her voice barely a whisper after he'd dissected some minor failure of mine. A B+ on a history paper, a moment of hesitation in a school debate. My father would just wave a dismissive hand, the gesture as sharp as a gavel's rap. "Elaine, she needs to toughen up," he'd say, not looking at me, but at some abstract point in the distance. The real world has no room for sensitivity. To him, sensitivity was a terminal diagnosis. And then there was Mark. My older brother was never the subject of those lectures because he was the verdict my father had always wanted. Mark was the yardstick against which I was perpetually measured and found wanting. He went to Harvard Law, just like Dad. He got a job on Wall Street, a shrine to the only god our father truly worshipped: capital. Every one of Mark's achievements was treated like a royal decree, framed and mounted in the gallery of our family's prestige. I remember the day Mark called to say he'd made junior partner. That evening, my father uncorked a bottle of 1990 Dom Perignon he'd been saving for a special occasion. The pop of the cork echoed through the house like a cannon shot of victory. He toasted Mark's killer instinct. A few years later, when I called home, my voice buzzing with pride, to announce I had been selected for my first command, a signal company of over 100 soldiers, my father's only response after a beat of silence was, "Does it pay better?" In his eyes, my career in the United States Army was nothing more than a bizarre, prolonged hobby. It was a rebellious phase I was supposed to have outgrown, like a teenager's punk rock fixation. The most painful memory, the one that feels like a scar I can trace with my finger, is from my graduation at West Point. It was a day steeped in honor and tradition that stretched back centuries. The long gray line. The roar of the jets overhead. The sheer, overwhelming pride of standing on that field, having survived 4 years of relentless mental and physical pressure. When we tossed our hats into the bright blue sky, I felt like I could conquer the world. I felt, for one fleeting moment, that I had finally done something so undeniably significant that even my father would have to acknowledge it. That night, our family went to a ridiculously expensive restaurant in Manhattan for a celebration. I sat there in my dress uniform, the stiff collar a comfort, the weight of it on my shoulders a source of pride. My father barely spoke a word about the graduation, about the commission, about the oath I had taken to defend our country. Instead, he held court for the guests he'd invited, his business associates, spinning tales of Mark's latest triumph. Mark just closed a 7-figure deal, he announced to the table, his voice booming with a pride I'd never once heard directed at me. He structured a leveraged buyout that was pure genius, a real shark. I just sat there, a captain in the U.S. Army, feeling completely and utterly invisible. I was a ghost at my own celebration, a footnote in the grand narrative of the Foster men. That was the moment I understood. It didn't matter what I accomplished. I could win a war single-handedly. And my father would only ask if it increased the family's net worth. If you've ever felt invisible in a moment that was supposed to be about you, hit the like button. And tell me in the comments, just one word, what you achieved that they ignored. My mother was the only one who saw me. She understood that my father's world was a language I could never and would never speak. Before she passed away from cancer, she did something quiet and radical. She secretly amended her will, leaving me sole trusteeship of her small, peaceful lake house in Virginia. It was our place, our sanctuary. It was where we'd go to escape the oppressive formality of Georgetown, where we'd skip rocks across the water and talk for hours. It held the only truly happy memories of my childhood. "It was my escape, Alexa," she told me once, her voice weak but clear. "And I want it to be yours." And now, my father was trying to strip that last piece of her from me. Driving through the streets of Arlington, the weight of the day pressing down, the truth crystallized into a single, painful thought. This lawsuit wasn't about a piece of property. It wasn't about money or assets. My father was suing me for the one crime he could never forgive. He was suing me for not being Mark. The flashbacks ended. The weight of the past dissolved as the sun began to rise. The next morning, at 0500 hours, I was in my car, navigating the pre-dawn quiet of the Baltimore-Washington Parkway on my way to Fort Meade, Maryland. My father's world of lawsuits and legacies, of Georgetown dinner parties and calculated insults, vanished in my rearview mirror. I was entering my world now, a world of orders, of clarity, of consequence. My office is a place most people only see in movies, and even then, they usually get it wrong. It's a SCIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility. To get inside, you have to pass through a door that looks like it belongs on a bank vault. There are no windows. The air is always chilled to a precise temperature to keep the servers from overheating, and it carries the constant low hum of machinery, the sound of data flowing, of secrets being kept. The only light comes from the cold blue glow of hundreds of monitors reflecting in the focused eyes of the men and women who work there. This is the new front line, the digital battlefield of the 21st century, and I am a commander here. I lead a team of what we call cyber hunters. My job, in the simplest terms, is to find the ghosts in our machine. We hunt for the digital fingerprints of foreign intelligence services, terrorist cells, and state-sponsored hacker groups who are trying to break into our networks, steal our intelligence, and disrupt our operations. The responsibility is immense, a crushing weight that never truly lifts. But it's also clean. It's definite. In my world, there are threats and there are countermeasures. There are assets to be protected and enemies to be neutralized. There is no gray area, no room for the kind of emotional manipulation that defined my family. Here, my value is measured in my performance, in my ability to anticipate a threat and shut it down. My authority is earned, not inherited. Just as I was starting my morning threat assessment, an email notification popped up on my secondary screen. The subject line was simply, "Congrats." It was from Mark. Attached was a link to a Forbes article profiling his hedge fund's record-breaking quarter. I clicked on it, and a picture of my brother filled the screen, smirking, confident, standing in a glass-walled office overlooking the Manhattan skyline. "Golden Boy Mark Foster does it again," the headline read. I read a few lines about his brilliant use of predictive algorithms to corner the market on some emerging tech sector. "Fantastic, Mark," I muttered to the empty air of the SCIF, a bitter taste in my mouth. "You use algorithms to make rich people richer. I use them to stop our nation's enemies from stealing the blueprints to a next-generation fighter jet." The contrast was a familiar, painful joke. It reminded me of a video call we'd had a few months back. He'd called from his car, a new Porsche judging by the headrest. "So, Al," he'd said, his tone a mixture of pity and condescension, "still playing those computer games for the government? When are you going to get a real job?" I remember just staring at his face on my phone screen, speechless. A real job. As if protecting the infrastructure of our national defense was somehow less real than trading stocks. The disconnect was so profound, it was almost absurd. I pushed the thought of him away, my focus snapping back to the main threat intel screen. One of my junior analysts, a sharp young sergeant named Diaz, flagged an anomaly. "Ma'am, got a ping. Looks like a phishing attempt against the Pentagon's logistics network. Pretty sophisticated." My pulse quickened. This was it, the hunt. For the next several hours, the world outside the SCIF ceased to exist. My team and I were locked in, a silent, coordinated dance of keystrokes and commands. The digital intrusion was more than sophisticated, it was elegant, surgical. A signature we recognized from a particularly aggressive foreign adversary. They were good, very good. But they were arrogant. "They're trying to brute force a secure server," Diaz reported, her voice tight with concentration. "They'll be locked out in 90 seconds. "No," I commanded, my voice sharp and clear, cutting through the hum of the servers. "Don't lock them out. I want to see where they go. Reroute their access path. Send them to Honeypot Zulu." A honeypot is a decoy, a fake network designed to look like the real thing, filled with tempting but worthless data. It's a trap. I want to know who they are, what tools they're using, and what their objective is. Give them the illusion of success. For the next 48 hours, we barely slept. We lived on stale coffee and pure adrenaline, tracking the intruders as they moved deeper and deeper into our digital maze. We profiled their software, traced their origins, and built a complete intelligence picture of their entire network. Then, when we had everything we needed, I gave the order. We didn't just kick them out. We dismantled their operation from the inside out. We burned their network to the ground. When it was over, my commanding officer, a stern, no-nonsense colonel, came down to the SCIF. He reviewed the after-action report, his eyes scanning the data on the screen. He didn't offer a flowery speech or a round of applause. He just looked at me, gave a single sharp nod, and said, "Good work, Captain." In our world, that nod was a medal. That simple acknowledgement of a job well done meant more to me than any accolade my father had ever withheld. It was real. It was earned. That evening, I drove home to my quiet, empty apartment in Arlington. The adrenaline from the operation had faded, leaving behind a familiar, hollow exhaustion. I pulled a Stouffer's frozen lasagna from the freezer and nuked it in the microwave. As I sat on my couch, eating the bland, uniform meal out of its plastic tray, I thought, I just helped neutralize a multi-million-dollar cyber attack against the Department of Defense, and nobody outside that windowless room would ever know. My name would never be in a headline. I flicked on the TV for some background noise and landed on CNBC. And there he was, Mark, being interviewed live on Closing Bell. He was talking about market volatility and fiscal strategy, looking smooth and powerful in his tailored suit. The irony was suffocating. I, Captain Alexa Foster, spend my life in the shadows, defending the very system of American freedom and capitalism that allows my brother to become a celebrated millionaire. And he calls what I do playing computer games. He and my father call me the failure. That feeling of profound loneliness, the kind that settles in your chest like a block of ice, was heavy that night. The glow of the television showing my brother's triumphant face only made my small apartment feel colder and emptier. But then, as I sat there in the dark, a different thought surfaced, cutting through the isolation. I remembered that I wasn't entirely alone. I had Sarah. That Saturday, I drove to Arlington National Cemetery. The sky was a crisp, cloudless blue, the kind of autumn day that feels both beautiful and melancholic. The vast expanse of white headstones rolled over the green hills in perfect, silent formation, a testament to a different kind of price paid for the world my brother so casually enjoyed. I didn't go to my mother's grave. After her death, my father had erected an ostentatious marble monument there, engraved not just with her name, but with the Foster family name in large, bold letters. It felt less like a place of remembrance for her and more like another plaque advertising his own legacy. Instead, I drove to Section 60. This part of the cemetery is different. It's newer, rawer. It's where the men and women who died in Iraq and Afghanistan are laid to rest. The headstones are the same simple white marble as in the older sections. But the feeling here is more immediate, the grief more tangible. You see fresh flowers, handwritten notes, small American flags fluttering in the breeze. I walked the familiar path to the grave of Colonel Jim DeMarco, my former commanding officer. He was killed by an IED in Kandahar 3 years ago. He was a good man, a great leader. The kind of man who knew the names of his soldiers' children. She was already there, as I knew she might be. Sarah DeMarco, Jim's wife, was kneeling on the grass, carefully replacing a single, perfect red rose in the small vase attached to the headstone. She was a woman forged in the unique fire of military life, strong, resilient, with a quiet grace that seemed unshakable. After Jim's death, she had channeled her grief into action, becoming a tireless advocate for Gold Star families, a pillar of the community I'd come to see as my own. She must have heard my footsteps on the grass because she looked up, and her face broke into a warm, genuine smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her eyes always held a shadow of her loss. She stood and brushed the grass from her knees, opening her arms as I approached. I stepped into her embrace, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I let my guard down. She held me tight, a hug that wasn't tentative or formal, but strong and encompassing. It felt like coming home. "Alexa, you're here," she murmured into my hair. She pulled back, her hands resting on my shoulders, and her gaze was searching, deeply perceptive. "You look exhausted, sweetie." It was such a simple sentence, but it almost broke me right there. There was no judgment in her voice, no questions about the lawsuit, no probing for details, just pure maternal concern. She didn't see Captain Foster, the cyber warfare officer. She saw Alexa, the tired young woman she knew, and she saw that I was hurting. In that moment, I felt more seen than I had in my entire life with my own family. "Come on," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You're coming home with me for dinner. I won't take no for an answer." Sarah's house was a modest but cozy colonial in a quiet Arlington neighborhood, the kind with a big front porch and a slightly overgrown garden. The moment I stepped inside, I was enveloped by the warm, savory aroma of roast chicken and rosemary. It was the scent of comfort, of care. This is nothing like the dry, overcooked roast beef and tense silence of my father's house, I thought. Her kitchen was the heart of the home, a little cluttered, with pictures of Jim and their 2 grown sons taped to the refrigerator. It was a space that felt lived in and loved in. We sat at her small kitchen table for hours. I talked, and she listened. I told her everything. About the courtroom, about the smug look on my father's face, about the calculated cruelty of Richard Cole's words, about Mark's dismissive phone calls. The wall I had so carefully constructed around myself in that courtroom, the discipline that had kept me standing tall and emotionless, finally began to crumble. I hadn't shed a single tear in front of my father or the judge, determined not to give them the satisfaction. But here, in the safety of Sarah's kitchen, the tears I had been holding back for so long started to fall. Silent and hot, tracing paths down my cheeks. "I just don't understand why he hates me so much, Sarah," I whispered, the words choked with a grief so old it felt like it was part of my DNA. "What did I ever do that was so wrong?" Sarah reached across the table and took both of my hands in hers. Her hands were warm and strong, the hands of a woman who had held a family together through deployments and loss. She looked me straight in the eye, her gaze firm and unwavering. "Don't you ever for 1 second think this is about you, Alexa," she said, her voice fierce with conviction. "This isn't hate. It's a failing in him, not you. And you have no idea how proud Jim was of you." My breath caught in my chest. "He talked about you all the time," she continued, her voice softening. "He once told me, Alexa Foster is the moral compass of that unit. She's our true north. When everything gets chaotic and the lines get blurry, you just have to look at what Foster is doing, and you'll know the right thing to do." True north. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow, but it was a blow that healed instead of wounded. It was validation. It was recognition. It was everything I had spent a lifetime starving for, delivered to me in a quiet kitchen by the widow of a fallen hero. That single piece of praise, spoken by a man I revered and relayed by a woman I loved, was worth more than all the money in my brother's hedge fund, more than the entire Foster estate, more than anything my father had ever built or owned. It was a compass, and it was pointing me back to myself. Sarah's words gave me strength. True north. It felt like a shield, a piece of armor I could strap on over my uniform. It was a reminder of who I was in the world that mattered, the world of honor and duty. But there was a bitter, painful irony that I couldn't escape. My true north, the very decision that Colonel DeMarco would have been proud of, was the exact thing my father and his lawyer were publicly labeling as gross misconduct. The truth behind that accusation wasn't a story of failure. It was a story of a calculated risk, a secret victory, and ultimately, a trap. It happened 6 months ago. The operation was codenamed Night Circuit. For weeks, my team had been tracking a highly skilled cell of foreign military hackers. They were ghosts, precise, disciplined, and technologically superior to almost any group we had encountered. They had already breached 2 low-level defense contractor networks, and we knew they were aiming for a much bigger prize, the master logistics network for all U.S. forces in the Pacific Theater. A successful breach there could cripple our operational readiness, putting thousands of American lives at risk. They were too good to catch with conventional defenses. They anticipated every move, every firewall, every digital tripwire. Trying to block them was like trying to catch smoke with a net. So I made a command decision. The only way to catch them was to let them win. This wasn't misconduct. I can hear myself explaining, my voice echoing in the memory of a tense briefing room. It was bait. I made the difficult, high-stakes call to deliberately and intentionally violate a minor security protocol. I created a vulnerability, a carefully crafted flaw in a peripheral system that, to a hacker of their caliber, would look like a sloppy mistake. An unlocked side door into a fortress. It was an irresistible target. It was the cheese in the mousetrap. And they took the bait. The moment their code slipped through that fabricated gap, we had them. But the trap wasn't about shutting them down immediately. It was about letting them think they were succeeding. For 72 straight hours, my team and I lived in that CF, watching them, tracking them, mapping their every move as they burrowed deeper into our honeypot, the elaborate decoy network we had built. We let them wander through our digital house of mirrors, and as they did, they gave us everything. We harvested their tools, their methods, their communication protocols, and the digital identities of every operative in their cell. By the time they realized they were in a trap, it was too late. We had effectively dismantled their entire global network. And, as we later learned from the CIA, the intelligence we gathered directly led to the emergency extraction and saving of at least 3 deep cover field agents who were about to be compromised. It was a massive, unqualified victory for U.S. Cyber Command. But in the military, there are rules. And any breach of protocol, even a deliberate, strategic one as part of a sanctioned operation, automatically triggers a formal CID investigation. It's procedural. It's non-negotiable. It's a way of ensuring that the breach was contained and that no classified information was genuinely compromised. It was an investigation I knew was coming, one that I fully expected would end with my name being cleared and a commendation being issued. A necessary bureaucratic epilogue to a successful mission. The problem was the timing. The investigation was officially on the record, but the final report exonerating me hadn't yet been released. And somehow, through the well-connected, ethically flexible channels of Washington, D.C.'s legal world, Richard Cole had gotten his hands on that single, damning piece of information. Captain Alexa Foster is under an active CID investigation. I remember the day I found out they knew. It was a few weeks before the initial court hearing. I went to my father's law firm on K Street, that prestigious corridor of power where deals that shape the country are made over handshakes and expensive lunches. His corner office had a sweeping view of the city, a landscape of marble and granite monuments. I stood before his massive mahogany desk, feeling like a child again, trying to explain the complexities of my world in a language he could understand. "Dad," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "I know what Cole is planning to do with this CID thing. You need to understand, it's just a formality. It's a procedural investigation. Everything was contained. The mission was a success. It's all going to be fine." I was hoping for a flicker of understanding, a moment where the father might see past the lawyer. I was a fool. Robert Foster leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, condescending smirk spreading across his face. It wasn't a smile of warmth or amusement. It was a smile of pity, the kind a professor might give a student who has completely missed the point. It was a look that did more damage than a physical slap ever could. "A formality," he scoffed, the word dripping with disdain. "Don't be naive, Alexa. In the real world, my world, the accusation is the conviction. The phrase under investigation is synonymous with guilty. Perception is reality." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl. "You have embarrassed this family. The Foster name has been built on a reputation of impeccable integrity and success for 3 generations. What am I supposed to say to my partners? To my friends at the Metropolitan Club? Oh yes, my daughter, the Army officer, is being investigated by the military police. Do you have any idea how that sounds?" I just stood there, speechless, the blood draining from my face. He wasn't listening. He didn't care about the truth, about the agents I saved, about the threat I neutralized. He only cared about the optics. about how my service, my sacrifice, reflected on him. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city as if he owned it. You chose this path, Alexa, this military adventure. I told you it was a mistake. I told you it would lead to nothing but trouble. He turned back to face me, his eyes cold and hard as granite. You are, and have always been, a profound disappointment. His final word, disappointment, cut deeper than any insult that had come before. It was a verdict delivered with the cold finality of a judge's gavel. That word echoed in my mind for days, a wound that refused to close. I replayed the scene in his K Street office over and over, the condescending smirk, the dismissal of my life's work. Still, a part of me, the part trained by 34 years of conditioning, tried to absorb the blow. I tried to compartmentalize the pain, to treat it like any other injury sustained in the line of duty. Acknowledge it, brace through it, and continue the mission. I tried to endure. But endurance has a breaking point. The final assault didn't come from my father. It came from his proxy, his perfect soldier. It came a week later when my phone rang with my brother's name flashing on the screen. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach, but I answered, my voice a flat, neutral, Mark. Listen, Al, he began. And I could already hear the Wall Street boardroom in his voice, that smooth, patronizing tone he used when he was about to explain something he assumed was beyond my simple comprehension. I'm trying to help you out here. Dad is furious. This whole lawsuit is looking really bad for the family brand, and frankly, it's becoming a distraction. I said nothing. I just stood in the middle of my living room, my knuckles turning white as I gripped my phone. The family brand. As if we were a corporation whose stock price was taking a hit. So, he continued, oblivious to my silence, I've worked out a proposal. A very reasonable one, I think. I could hear the rustle of papers on his end, as if he were reading from a prepared term sheet. We will buy you out, he said, the phrase dripping with the casual arrogance of a corporate raider discussing a hostile takeover. We'll pay you fair market value for the lake house. Cash offer. In return, you drop the suit, walk away, and, handle your little CID problem quietly. You're embarrassing everyone, Al. And then came the words that finally broke the dam. Don't be so selfish, he said, his voice laced with manufactured exasperation. It's just a house. Think about the family's reputation. Selfish? Reputation? The words detonated in my mind. A white-hot rage, purer and more intense than anything I had ever felt, surged through me. It was so powerful, it was clarifying, like a bolt of lightning that illuminates a dark landscape in a single, brilliant flash. In that instant, everything became perfectly, terrifyingly clear. Selfish? I had just voluntarily walked into the line of fire on a classified mission, risking my career and my reputation to protect national security, and he had the audacity to call me selfish for wanting to keep the one thing my mother had left for me. For wanting to defend my own honor, reputation. He dared to lecture me about reputation while my father was actively, methodically, and maliciously trying to assassinate my character in a court of law. They were trying to destroy my honor, something forged in service, duty, and sacrifice, to protect their reputation. Something built on money, prestige, and appearances. That was it. The final straw. The line that had been bent and strained for my entire life finally snapped. The soldier who had been trained to hold her ground, to absorb enemy fire, suddenly received a new set of orders, issued from the deepest part of her own being. Counterattack. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. That would have been giving him what he wanted, an emotional reaction he could dismiss as hysterical. Instead, I did the one thing he wouldn't expect. I hung up. I just pressed the red icon on the screen, cutting him off mid-sentence. For a long moment, I stood there in the ringing silence, my breathing steady, my pulse even. A strange, cold calm washed over me. The pain was gone, replaced by something harder, something sharper. It was the icy resolve of a commander who has just made a decision from which there is no retreat. They had made a profound miscalculation. They saw me as the family's black sheep, the lost little girl playing soldier. They were about to learn that in the United States Army, we don't raise sheep. We train wolves. If you have ever reached that point where you knew you couldn't take it anymore, that you had to fight back, just type, "I'm a wolf" in the comments. Let's see how many of us there are. And hit that like button if you're ready to see what happens when a wolf is cornered. My movements became fluid, precise, driven by a new and absolute purpose. I walked to my desk, picked up my phone, and scrolled through my contacts. I bypassed my personal address book and went straight to my encrypted military contacts. My finger stopped on a name. I pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Major Ortiz." "Major," I replied, my voice as calm and steady as a sniper's breath. "This is Captain Foster. I need your help." My call to Major Ortiz set the wheels in motion. The moment I hung up with my brother, the soldier took over. The hurt, the rage, I didn't discard them. I repurposed them. They became fuel for the engine of strategy. I wasn't going to simply defend myself against my father's accusations anymore. I was going on the offensive. I was going to prepare a battlefield my father and his high-powered civilian lawyer couldn't possibly comprehend. 2 days later, I met Major Lena Ortiz at a crowded Starbucks in Tyson's Corner. The place was buzzing with the typical Northern Virginia traffic. Government contractors talking in acronyms, young professionals hammering away on laptops. Ortiz was a sharp, no-nonsense JAG lawyer with a reputation for being fiercely intelligent and even more fiercely loyal to the soldiers she advised. She stirred her black coffee, her gaze direct and analytical over the rim of the paper cup. "Captain Foster," she began, getting straight to the point. "You know I can't represent you in a civilian court. My jurisdiction ends at the gates of Fort Belvoir." "I know, Major," I replied, leaning forward. "I don't need representation. I need intelligence. I need you to help me declassify a very specific piece of a document." I slid a piece of paper across the small table with a single phrase written on it. "Operation Night Circuit." I need the executive summary of the commendation report, just the conclusion. The part that proves the subsequent CID investigation was purely procedural and resulted in my exoneration. Ortiz's eyebrows shot up. She knew exactly what I was asking for. Navigating the bureaucracy to get even a single sentence of a classified after-action report declassified was a nightmare. "Foster, that's a tall order," she said, her tone cautious. "You're asking me to poke the bear at NSA and Cybercom. It could take months if it happens at all." "I don't have months," I said simply. "The next hearing is in 1 week." She studied my face for a long moment, then a slow, determined smile touched her lips. "Okay," she said. "It's a long shot. But let me see what I can do. I know a few people who owe me favors." Then came the second phase of my plan. "There's something else," I said, lowering my voice. "I've filed a motion for a change of venue. I've requested the case be moved to the Arlington County Circuit Court." Ortiz frowned. "Why?" "The D.C. court is where your father filed. It's his home turf." "Exactly," I said. "His lawyer, Richard Cole, is arrogant. He's a D.C. power player. He thinks this is just another messy family dispute he can win by bullying and throwing money around. He sees an old judge on the bench and assumes he's just some local fixture." My voice hardened. "I don't see an old judge. I see Brigadier General Donovan, retired. I ran his service record. 3 years ago, he was the commanding general at Fort Belvoir. He signed the operational orders for Night Circuit." The understanding dawned on Ortiz's face, and her smile widened into a grin. "Captain," she said, shaking her head in admiration, "you really are a cyber warfare officer. You haven't just prepared a defense, you've set a trap." Despite the plan, despite the flicker of hope, the days leading up to the hearing were agonizing. The night before, sleep was impossible. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through 1,000 worst-case scenarios. What if Ortiz couldn't get the document? What if the bureaucracy was too slow, too stubborn? What if Judge Donovan didn't remember a single operation from 3 years ago among the hundreds he must have overseen? What if my entire strategy, my one shot at reclaiming my name, was based on a flawed assumption? The weight of the fight. The sheer exhaustion of having to prove my own worth against the people who were supposed to believe in me pressed down on me. For a moment, the soldier faltered and the lonely daughter resurfaced, riddled with doubt. At 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep. I pulled on a pair of running shoes and my old army sweatshirt and drove into the deserted city. The streets of Washington, D.C. are different in the dead of night. Quiet, empty, monumental. I parked near the National Mall and walked through the cool, damp air toward the Lincoln Memorial. I walked up the marble steps alone, my footsteps echoing in the vast, silent space. There he was, Abraham Lincoln, sitting in his great chair, his stone face etched with the burdens of a nation torn apart. He looked out over the reflecting pool, toward the Washington Monument, a silent, eternal guardian. I stood before him, feeling impossibly small, and read the words carved into the stone wall to my left, the words of the Gettysburg Address. My eyes found the final powerful line, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, that these dead shall not have died in vain. I thought of Colonel Jim DeMarco, lying in his grave across the river in Arlington. I thought of the soldiers I served with, the men and women I was tasked to protect in a war fought with ones and zeros. I thought of the oath I took at West Point, an oath to a set of ideals, to a constitution, to a way of life. My father was fighting this battle for a house, for money, for the hollow prize of his reputation among other rich men. He was fighting for things. I was fighting for something else entirely. I was fighting for my honor. Standing there, in the presence of that great, silent statue, my resolve hardened into steel. I would not let the sacrifice of men like Jim DeMarco be cheapened. I would not let my own service be defined by the petty ambitions of my father. I would not let my honor be a casualty in his war for status. The doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, clear certainty. I knew what I had to do. The next day, I walked into the Arlington County Circuit Court. The resolution I had found at the foot of the Lincoln Memorial was a cold, hard stone in the center of my being. This time, I didn't enter the courtroom as a defendant, bracing for impact. I entered as an officer, prepared to present the facts. My uniform felt different today. Not like armor to protect me, but like a banner representing the very honor I was here to defend. Richard Cole, however, was oblivious to the shift in the atmosphere. He stood before the bench, radiating the same smug self-assurance he had before. He was on his home turf, or so he thought. He launched into his pre-rehearsed attack, his voice filled with practiced indignation. Your Honor, today we will present further evidence demonstrating Captain Foster's pattern of reckless behavior, proving conclusively that she is unfit. That's enough, Counselor. Judge Donovan's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through Cole's rhetoric like a laser. He raised a hand, a simple gesture that brought the entire room to a dead halt. Cole froze mid-sentence, his mouth slightly agape. The judge turned his calm, assessing gaze from the sputtering lawyer to me. Captain Foster, he said, his tone even and direct. Mr. Cole has made some very serious allegations regarding this CID investigation. Do you have anything you wish to present on the matter? Every eye in the room swiveled to me. I could feel the weight of their collective stare. Across the room, I saw my father, Robert, lean back slightly in his chair, a faint, condescending smirk playing on his lips. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. The moment the little soldier girl would try to defend herself and end up getting tangled in her own words, proving his point for him. He thought he was about to watch me self-destruct. I met the judge's gaze, my posture unwavering. Yes, Your Honor, I do, I said, my voice clear and steady, carrying easily through the silent room. At this time, I would like to submit this document into evidence. On cue, the courtroom doors at the back of the room opened. A figure stood silhouetted against the light of the hallway for a moment before stepping inside. It was Major Lena Ortiz, immaculate in her own Army service uniform. She walked with a confident, measured stride down the center aisle, holding a sealed manila envelope. The only sounds in the room were the quiet, rhythmic clicks of her heels on the linoleum floor. She didn't look at me or my father. Her focus was entirely on the court clerk, to whom she handed the envelope. "This, Your Honor," I announced as the clerk passed the document to the judge, "is the partially declassified executive summary and commendation memo directly pertaining to the investigation Mr. Cole has so eagerly referenced." The shift in the room was palpable. It was as if the atmospheric pressure had suddenly dropped. Richard Cole's face, once flushed with aggressive confidence, turned a pasty, chalk white. He stared at Major Ortiz, then at the envelope in the judge's hand, his mind clearly scrambling to process this unexpected tactical maneuver. Beside him, my father's smirk vanished, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then alarm. The trap was sprung. Judge Donovan took the envelope, broke the official seal, and slid the single-page document out. He put on a pair of reading glasses and began to read, his expression unchanging. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up, his eyes locking onto Richard Cole. "Counselor," the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet, "this document is classified at the secret no-foreign level. Were you, at any point, granted the security clearance necessary to access the details of this military investigation?" Cole was flustered. He stood up, then sat down again, shuffling his papers. "Well, no, Your Honor, but the existence of the investigation is a matter of public—" "That was not my question," Donovan interrupted, his voice turning to ice. "The answer is no. Therefore, Counselor, I suggest you remain silent on matters you know nothing about before you find yourself in violation of federal law." He didn't raise his voice, but the threat was unmistakable. Cole sank into his chair, looking as if he'd been punched. Then Judge Donovan turned his full attention back to me. A flicker of something, not a smile, but a shared understanding, passed between us. "Captain Foster," he said, his voice now holding a note of formal respect, "the last time I saw your name, it was on a commendation summary that crossed my desk after Operation Night Circuit. The name of the operation, spoken aloud, was the final confirmation." My father's head snapped up. Mark stared, his mouth hanging open. The trap had closed. The judge handed the document to the court clerk. "For the record," he commanded, "please read the concluding paragraph." The clerk, a small woman with a clear, steady voice, began to read. The words filled the stunned silence of the courtroom. "For exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services to the United States, Captain Alexa Foster demonstrated decisive leadership and tactical brilliance under extreme pressure. Her unconventional and courageous command decision directly resulted in the complete neutralization of a significant national security threat. In light of these results, the procedural investigation by the Criminal Investigation Division is hereby recommended for immediate closure with the highest possible commendation." The clerk finished reading. The silence that followed was absolute, profound. It was the silence of a checkmate. Slowly, I turned my head and looked at my father. The blood had drained from his face, leaving it a sickly, grayish pallor. His lips were trembling, and his eyes, for the first time, were wide with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He stared at me as if he were seeing a stranger, a ghost. He leaned forward, and in a hoarse, strangled whisper that was somehow audible in the dead quiet, he asked a question not to the court, but to himself. You were that Foster?" The war was over, and I had won. In the deafening silence that followed the clerk's final word, I held my father's shocked gaze. His question, You were that Foster?" hung in the air between us, a fragile bridge across a lifetime of misunderstanding. I rose slowly to my full height, my posture perfect, my uniform seeming to settle more comfortably on my shoulders. I looked at the man who was my father, but I addressed my answer to the officer who had once signed my mission orders. "Your Honor," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I always have been." Judge Donovan nodded once, a gesture of finality. He brought the gavel down again. "This case is dismissed, with prejudice." As I walked out of the courtroom, a strange emptiness washed over me. I didn't feel the triumphant thrill of victory I'd expected. There was no surge of adrenaline, no desire to celebrate. I just felt tired, utterly and completely exhausted. And beneath the exhaustion, a new feeling was taking root. A feeling I hadn't realized I was missing until this very moment. Freedom. The freedom from the crushing weight of constantly trying to prove I was worthy. My father was already gone when I reached the hallway, swept away by his now silent lawyer. He didn't say a word as he left. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. The invincible, articulate Robert Foster, for the first time in his life, was speechless. But my brother, Mark, was waiting for me. He looked lost, his usual Wall Street swagger completely gone. "Al," he started, his voice uncertain. "Al, I didn't know." I held up a hand, stopping him. My gaze was level, my voice devoid of heat or anger. It was just empty. "Don't, Mark," I said. "Just don't say anything." I didn't have the energy for his excuses or his sudden remorse. I simply walked past him, leaving him standing alone in the echoing marble corridor. Life settled into a new kind of quiet. A month later, an official letter arrived from the Pentagon. It was printed on heavy cream-colored stationery, formal and official. It stated that the CID investigation was officially closed and that, upon review of Operation Night Circuit, I was being awarded the Meritorious Service Medal for my leadership. I read the letter twice, then put it on my kitchen counter. It felt good, but it also felt like a confirmation of a truth I had already found for myself. The real celebration came that weekend. Sarah DeMarco refused to let the moment pass unmarked. She threw a small party for me at her house. There were no powerful guests or expensive champagne. It was just a handful of close friends, other military spouses, a few officers from my unit, and Major Ortiz. We had a barbecue in her backyard, grilling burgers and drinking cheap beer out of the bottle. We laughed and told stories, and for the first time, I felt the warmth of genuine, unconditional pride from the people around me. The simple, heartfelt, "Congratulations, Alexa," from a friend grilling hot dogs meant more than any recognition my father could have ever offered. This was my family, the one I had chosen and the one that had chosen me back. I was getting more respect and affection over a paper plate of potato salad than I had ever received in a lifetime of sitting at the Foster family's mahogany table. Then, a few weeks after that, Mark called again. His voice was different this time. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a strained, hesitant tone I'd never heard from him before. "Al," he said, "it's about Dad. He's not doing well. He hasn't left the house since the hearing. He won't talk to anyone. I thought, maybe if you called him, maybe you could just talk to him." I closed my eyes and took a long, slow breath. I could picture my father, alone in that big, silent house in Georgetown, the fortress of his pride finally breached. A year ago, this call would have been a weapon against me, a guilt trip designed to pull me back into the family drama. A year ago, I would have felt responsible. I would have felt the familiar pull of duty to a family that had never been dutiful to me. But the woman who had stood in that courtroom was not the same woman who answered the phone today. "Mark," I said, and my voice was calm, measured, and resolute. "That is not your problem to solve, and it is not mine. It's his." I paused, letting the words sink in, drawing a line in the sand not with anger, but with absolute finality. "Don't call me about this again." And I hung up. The border was drawn. The gate was closed. That evening, I was having coffee with Sarah, and I told her about the call. She listened patiently, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think you'll ever forgive them?" she asked gently. I stared into my coffee cup, watching the steam rise. The question was heavier than it sounded. I thought about my father's face in the courtroom. I thought about Mark's selfish transactional offer on the phone. "I don't know," I confessed, the words tasting strange and honest on my tongue. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Sarah. It doesn't mean erasing the damage. I looked up and met her wise, compassionate eyes. And it certainly doesn't mean giving them the chance to do it all over again. Right now, more than anything else, I just want peace. Peace. That was what I had been looking for. Not victory, not vengeance, not even forgiveness. Just a quiet space to breathe, to be. A year passed, a year of healing, of quiet rebuilding, of learning to live without the constant weight of disapproval on my shoulders. The seasons turned, and so did I. Today, I am Major Alexa Foster. The silver oak leaf insignia on my collar feels heavier, more solid than the parallel bars of a captain. It feels earned. I'm standing in a sterile, windowless classroom at Fort Meade, not as a hunter, but as an instructor. Before me sits a group of newly minted captains, their faces young, eager, and a little intimidated. They are the next generation of cyber warfare officers, the future guardians of that invisible battlefield. I'm teaching a course on advanced network defense strategies, but today's lesson is on something less tangible. Your job is not just about code and countermeasures, I tell them, my voice calm and confident, echoing slightly in the quiet room. It's not about the technical specs of the weapon. It's about the integrity of the person wielding it. In the fog of a digital war, when data is deceptive and the enemy is faceless, your technology will fail you. Your intellect might fail you. The only thing that won't is your character. I look from face to face, trying to impress upon them the lesson that had cost me so much to learn. Your mission, above all else, is to be the true north when every other compass is spinning. That is your ultimate responsibility. To your unit, to your country, and to yourselves. In that moment, I realized that the legacy of Colonel Jim DeMarco, his belief in a moral compass, had been passed on. And now, it was becoming my own legacy to share. I kept my mother's lake house. The lawsuit was dismissed, the deed was cleared, and it became mine, officially. But my ownership of it has nothing to do with legal papers anymore. I drive out there most weekends, leaving the rigid geometry of Washington, D.C. behind for the gentle curving shoreline of the Virginia countryside. It's my sanctuary, my escape. I spend hours on the wide wooden porch that overlooks the water, often doing nothing more than sipping a tall glass of iced tea and watching the sunlight dance on the gentle ripples of the lake. The house is filled with my mother's memory, but it's no longer a place of grief. It's a place of profound peace. It is mine, not because I won a court case, but because I have finally, truly come to believe that I am worthy of the peace it offers. Life has a quiet, comfortable rhythm now. It's a life I've built for myself, on my own terms. But the past doesn't simply vanish. It just loses its power. One evening, I was on my couch, reading a book, when my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced at it, expecting a message from Sarah or one of my team members. But the name on the screen made my breath catch in my throat. It was my father. The first message from him in over a year. My thumb hovered over the notification, a strange sense of dread and curiosity warring within me. I finally tapped it open. The message was short, just a few words. Your mother would have been proud. Dinner. Sometime. My heart gave a painful little lurch, a ghost of an old reflex. It was the involuntary flinch of a wound that has long since scarred over, but still remembers the pain. There was a time, not so long ago, when a message like that would have shattered my defenses. The younger Alexa, the one who was starving for a single crumb of approval, would have dissolved into tears of relief. She would have seen those words as an olive branch, an armistice, a chance to finally have the father she'd always wanted. But that Alexa died in the Arlington County courtroom. She was a casualty of a war I had to win to survive. I looked at the message on the screen for a long time. I saw the clumsy attempt at reconciliation. I saw the tacit admission of my worth, now that it had been validated by the world he respected. But I also saw what wasn't there. An apology? An acknowledgement of the pain he caused. Any real understanding. It was an invitation back to his world, on his terms. I didn't reply. My finger moved to the delete button, but I paused. Deleting it felt too angry, too reactive. It felt like giving the message a power it didn't deserve. Instead, I tapped the other option, the Archive button. The message vanished from my main inbox, not erased, but simply filed away. It's still there, I suppose. A piece of data, sorted and categorized, stripped of its power to harm me. It exists, but it is no longer a part of my active emotional life. It's a relic from a past I no longer inhabit. The Foster family legacy, with its emphasis on reputation and wealth, belongs to my father and to Mark. I truly hope they find happiness in it. But my legacy? My legacy is different. I am building it myself. One mission, one soldier, one honorable decision at a time. I am building it every day with honor. And it is entirely my own. And so, that's my story. My journey was about finding my own true north in a world that tried to hand me a broken compass. I know many of you listening have faced your own battles against the expectations of others, fighting to be seen for who you truly are. Remember that your value is never determined by the family you were born into, but by the honor and the legacy you build for yourself every single day. If this story moved you, please share just one word in the comments that you want your own legacy to be. And if you believe in the power of resilience and reclaiming your voice, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that remind us that we are all stronger than we think. Thank you for listening.